Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jessie and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week we have Marla Cruz with us, who will be talking about reproductive justice, SB 315 in Texas, barring 18, 19, and 20-year-olds from working in strip clubs, and why strippers should support decrim. Who misses free and affordable ads and social networks without the anti-sex work rhetoric? Assembly 4 is a team of sex workers and technologists in Melbourne, Australia, aiming to bring back free and fair advertising and social spaces to the sex working community. They also give back to organizations based in harm reduction, sex work, and education. Stepping away from the clunky design of traditional platforms, their two products, Tryst.link and Switter.at, are refreshing and well-needed changes in both presentation and mission. Both are free to join and open to all. In the words of an A4 user, from the policies to the language to the advice and tips, it makes such a big difference to feel encouraged and supported instead of policed. Check out their website, assembly4.com, for the word and not the number, for more info. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This is Jessie Sage. I am your host. I am solo today, but not really, because I have a great guest. I'm talking to Marla Cruz, who I'd actually been wanting to talk to for a while. I heard her on another podcast and talking about why strippers should support decriminalization, and her work is really interesting, and so I wanted to get her on our podcast as well. But it turns out that she is also from Texas and is a dancer there. And last week, Texas passed SB 315 that bars 18, 19, and 20-year-old strippers from working in clubs. And so it was a great opportunity to talk to her about that too. So I think you will get a lot out of the episode. She is very well educated about decrim and state legislatures and anti-abortion movements and anti-trafficking movements and a lot of things that are going on within both reproductive and sex work politics. So I hope you enjoy that. I do want to say that I feel a little bit bad that we didn't put out more than one episode last month. This episode is going to be coming out tomorrow, which is June 1st. So this is a June episode. We only got one out in May, and that's because May just went kind of crazy. I can't even believe how fast this year is going. As many of you know, because we've talked a little bit about this, PJ finished his PhD. He graduated. And so we went to Maryland, where he went to school, and had a little graduation ceremony. It was funny because they didn't have one because of COVID. So we just went as a family, like with his parents and his grandmother, who said she was going to stay alive until he got his PhD, and she did it. So it's great. We all went there, and his mom did a little speech, and his grandma hooded him, and that was very sweet because, I don't know, he's a quiet introvert who would hate a big ceremony. So just doing a tiny family one was great. So we were busy with that, did some traveling in May. We are doing some traveling in June as well, but nothing so ceremonious. PJ and I are just going to Vegas for a week, and I cannot wait. And we're going to go hang out with our friend Princess Burple, who's also the friend of the show. For those of you who listen, she's been on several times, I think. So yeah, we have some fun stuff going on this summer. I hope you all do too. I hope you're taking advantage of the fact that with higher vaccination rates, people can start seeing each other again. So that's really, really great. I'm happy to see that, because I don't know about you all, but I can't look at my computer screen very much anymore. I'm kind of zoomed out and media fatigued, because I just want to see people now after a year of being inside my house. So hopefully you all are starting to be able to go back out and about again and see the people that you love. We're just starting to get there here in Pennsylvania. That's all I have for now. I do want to quickly remind you that we have a Patreon, and if you like what we're doing here, we would very much appreciate your support. It's patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Thank you for everybody who's been supporting us up until this point. We also have a merch store at peepshowmagazine.com. You can check out merchandise if you're interested in hoodies or stickers or anything like that. I also wanted to tell you that Angela Jones wrote a new piece for the magazine that you can find at peepshowmagazine.com. It's the featured article right now, and it's really informative and really important. She talks about what's happened 6 months after Visa and MasterCard pulled out of Pornhub. So this is an evolving story. It hasn't been totally resolved. It's very important for porn performers to understand what's going on with that. So if you haven't read it, go check it out at peepshowmagazine.com. That is all the news I have for you today. I want to just wrap this up so we can move right into Marla's interview. I'm here today with Marla Cruz, who is a proud Texan, stripper, and socialist who cut her teeth in the reproductive justice movement. You can find her on Twitter at ProlaPeach and her new blog, Sex Worker Socialism, at marlacruz.substack.com. So welcome, Marla. I am excited to talk to you today.
Hello, hello. It's good to be here.
I actually didn't know that you started in reproductive justice. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we move into sex work?
Yeah, I'll start kind of way back whenever I was in high school. In 2011, the Texas legislature passed a bill to cut funding for Planned Parenthood. So while I
Mm-hmm.
was in high school and I was receiving reproductive health care and birth control from Planned Parenthood, I was actually personally affected by that piece of legislation that cut their funding because in the
Yeah.
months that I was receiving health care from them, I had the manager of the local Planned Parenthood sit me down and say, our services are no longer going to be sliding scale. The state cut our funding, so we can no longer provide free birth control. And
Wow.
she gave me, a grace period of 3 months of
Mm-hmm.
retaining those sliding scale services, and then I would have to start paying for for the access to that health care.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that kind of started you on your activist route.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I went to college the following year, I was very active in the reproductive justice movement here in Texas. And of course, with pieces of
Mm-hmm.
legislation like that. And if people maybe remember the 2013 Wendy Davis filibuster in the Texas legislature, where she spoke on abortion rights and abortion access for, I believe it was close to 13 hours.
Oh
And
my gosh.
thousands of people came to the Capitol building in Austin to occupy the building and to shout down the Texas legislature. And this was, I
Wow.
believe, in June of
Okay.
2013. I feel so old now. That was like almost 10 years ago. But
Yeah. Time
but
just
that
passes. It's so weird. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But that was my first mass action, was showing up to the Texas Capitol for abortion rights with thousands and thousands of other people, and watching grandmas getting arrested by the Texas Capitol Police and being dragged out of the
Wow.
building because after midnight we were illegally occupying the building. So we all got pushed out by the police.
Wow. Do you feel like that event like radicalized you?
I feel like I was radicalized by losing my reproductive health care access. Just
Yeah.
I didn't know how to put it into words until I got to college and I read the theory and I did the activism, showing up to events like that, and also being an abortion clinic escort
Yeah.
in Fort Worth, Texas, is where I was an abortion clinic escort.
Okay.
And I was also involved in some fundraisers for the local abortion access network, the Texas Equal Access Fund, the T Fund,
Hmm.
that is based out of North Texas and provides funds for people seeking abortions.
Yeah. So for people who don't know what abortion escorts do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, talk specifically about what was going on at the Fort Worth abortion clinic, where the property lines around the clinic, it was kind of a building kind of on its own lot on the corner of like this little concrete end. And
Mhm.
the property lines in the parking lot of the abortion clinic were drawn in such a way where anti abortion protesters could line themselves along the sidewalk right up against the cars that were parked
Oh
next to
my
the
gosh.
building. So
Yeah,
they could get right in the faces of people coming in and trying to seek abortion care. And so
right.
we were there to create a barrier on that property line that was drawn kind of a foot into the parking lot between the people seeking access and care and the people there to shout at them and belittle them and try to terrorize them out of an abortion. Essentially,
Yeah.
that's part of what abortion clinic volunteers do, is create that
Mhm.
barrier between the anti-abortion protesters and the people seeking care.
Yeah, that's such important work because of those circumstances. I mean, I'm in Pittsburgh and we have kind of a similar situation, not with the parking lot because our main clinic is downtown. So, but there's like a border in a circle around the front door, but are all circling the front door, like around it. And we have escorts for the same reason.
Yeah, that's common at a lot of abortion clinics, it seems, is
Hmm.
that the anti-abortion protesters will show up and just basically,
Like
skirt.
terrorize people. Yeah.
Yeah, terrorize people and, like, skirt the lines of, like, what is legal and what is outright assault and harassment.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, that you started out there. Like, when did you get into dancing, and how did you kinda transform your activism to sex work activism?
Well, whenever I graduated college, I had aspirations of working in nonprofits, in the
Mm,
progressive
mhm.
nonprofits out in Texas. And while there are certainly good actors doing their best in these organizations, the overall structure of the nonprofit industry is extremely exploitative.
Mm,
And
mhm.
I was, fresh out of college making, it was minimum wage essentially with the hours that I was working on a salaried position working at a nonprofit.
Yeah.
And so I worked in a progressive nonprofit that had to do with voting rights and with voting access, and so I worked the whole 2016 election cycle
Oh, wow.
in voting access, and you can imagine after doing, months of that kind of work and then seeing Donald Trump win was
Yeah. Mhm.
extremely demoralizing. I mean, so much hard work
Yeah.
for so little
Yeah.
money, and then that's, the fruit of our labor was that.
Right. Mhm.
So
Yeah.
so I was honestly with the low wages combined with the just the pure demoralization of working in, voting access in
Mhm.
Texas, I was done. I mean, I was completely burnt out after one election cycle, and so I left my job, and the following year, I started, dancing at clubs,
Mhm.
and it's so interesting to be able to kind of draw these connections that I made, when I was younger in high school, in college,
Mhm.
about, about abortion access and reproductive justice, and connect them to decriminalization of sex work and control over
Yeah.
people's bodies, uh,
Mhm.
and state manipulation
Right.
of women's labor, of feminized labor,
Mhm.
and poorly paid people in the market, because there's a direct line between the reproductive justice movement and the movement for the full decriminalization of sex work. And I want to point this out, that whenever
Mhm.
I was in college getting into reproductive justice movement work, there was a lot of talk about what's called crisis pregnancy centers, which are essentially organizations that are most often religiously affiliated and funded through like the Catholic Church and stuff like that, that are fake clinics and
Right.
that advertise themselves as offering pregnancy care. And the whole point of
Right.
these fake clinics that often have like registered nurses, but they don't provide any sort of medical care or medical access,
Mhm.
that will basically, their whole deal is to manipulate people out of getting an abortion and to lie to people about how far along they are in their pregnancy so they can, abortion becomes more expensive the further you are in pregnancy. And so to
Yeah.
try to keep them from getting any sort of abortion access through outright lies and manipulation. And that kind of problem, the crisis pregnancy centers, it was and still continues to be like a huge problem in Texas. Like if
Mhm.
I mean, local high schools, particularly the high school that I went to, if you went to like the school nurse and said something like you thought you were pregnant, you thought you could get pregnant, or that you were having like unprotected sex, they would give you a card to the local crisis pregnancy center instead of the
Yeah.
local Planned
Mhm.
Parenthood. And the
Right, right.
people, you'll see this now because the people who were heavily involved in the movement for crisis pregnancy centers against abortion access are now the same people involved in this human trafficking
Right.
rhetoric
Mhm.
that we see these days. And it's the same organizations, it's the same people. It's kind of wild to me to be able to see
Mhm.
this happen over time, to see the ways that access to abortion and the criminalization of sex work are both kind of melded together in this idea of like control over people's bodies and
Right.
what the state will criminalize you for. And a lot of the
Yeah.
language is the same.
I think you're very right. I think it's like a control of women's bodies, and of, bodily autonomy in both cases.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And in a state like Texas, I feel like up north they're a little too cute about it. Like there's a lot of lip service to like progressive causes and to like women's rights and abortion rights and stuff like that, but
Mhm.
ultimately like the austerity of the state, like constantly cutting funding for different programs and constantly leaving poor people more and more precarious without these social programs. Like in Texas, they don't bother with the window dressing. They will
Right. Mhm.
outright say, local Texas representatives will outright say, we don't want women getting an abortion. We don't want
Yeah.
women doing
Mhm.
prostitution. They don't bother with any of the lip service to say like, no, we're actually interested in these women's well being, because they're not, and they don't even pretend to be.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that those connections are really important, like the connections between like women's or between like reproductive health and the decriminalization movement. I think you're right to like point out how tightly woven these are, and how the political I don't know, the political agendas to end abortion are the same ones to end all sex work, to end pornography and close strip clubs and everything else.
hmm There was a real light bulb moment for me. There used to be a conference called Red State. It's called the Red State Conference, Reproductive Justice Perspectives from Red States. And it was in
Yeah, I
Tulsa,
think one of my friends
Oklahoma.
went to that.
Yeah, it was in Norman,
Uh-huh.
Oklahoma. Excuse me. It was in Norman, Oklahoma. And it was this yearly conference the prevailing issue was reproductive health care access and
Mhm.
abortions and abortion rights access. But the concept of reproductive justice itself is so expansive and inclusive, to where you would have panels on everything from abortion rights to, the Black Lives Matter movement, to mental health care access and the
Mhm.
criminalization of mental illness. So, this inclusiveness, I remember there was one speaker, I wish I could remember what her name was, but she was talking about these anti choice activists that will
Mhm.
protest outside of abortion clinics, like I was speaking on earlier. She
Yeah.
said, they are not pro life, they are pro criminalization. And that
Mhm.
was a real
Mhm.
light bulb moment for me, because in these days, like I said, the people in Texas are much less inclined to bother with the progressive rhetoric, and so what you'll have is the same people who want to criminalize abortion doctors are the same people who want to criminalize sex workers, and so
Right.
you see this coalition across these groups of people who
Mhm.
are interested in more police, more policing, more people in prison, more women in prison, more poor people in prison. You'll see this
Right.
coalition happen like across time and across pieces of legislation that hurt abortion access and that hurt sex workers.
Yeah, so let's talk about Texas for a minute. Let's talk about what's going on there. So last week, SB 315 passed, which made it against the law for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds to work in strip clubs. I saw that you were tweeting about that, about the impact that it's already having. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I am actually returning to work this week. I'm returning to the strip club after, since March of 2020. I've been
Yeah.
unemployed the entirety of COVID, so I'm going back to work. And
Mhm.
I went to audition this past week, just 2 days after this piece of legislation passed and where everybody had to be fired. I auditioned for a club, and during the audition, I was asking about what happened with this piece of legislation. I was hearing from my friends who were under
Mhm.
21 from different cities that they had just gotten fired and they had just gotten, texts from their managers saying, "I'm sorry, you don't have a job here anymore." And the
Wow.
manager told me that they had to fire about 55 different people from the club, from the wait staff to the dancers themselves. They had to fire about 55 people. And this is a club, it's a huge club. I mean, I joke about this a
Yeah.
lot, but I 100% mean it. Texas strip clubs, a lot of them are the size of like a Macy's department store. I mean, it's huge. And
We
so
have this stereotype that everything is big in Texas, but, like, the strip clubs must also fit that, huh?
absolutely, that it's not a stereotype, it's 100% true, and I say that as a proud born and raised Texan. But the clubs, you hear about 55 people getting fired, and you're like, "Wow, that's a lot of people," and it's like, well, that's just how big the clubs are. The club that
Yeah.
I work at now runs over 100 dancers on the weekends, like Thursday to Sunday.
Wow. Oh
It's
my
a
gosh.
huge
Yeah.
club. So that's a lot of people fired, but these clubs employ a lot of people. These are a lot of jobs that people are losing, and abruptly so. There were managers that didn't even know that this piece of legislation was going through the House and through the Senate. And I was
Mhm.
messaging with one dancer who I believe works out of Houston, who was asking her manager, "Is this law now? Like, are people going to get fired?" And the manager was mistaken in thinking that they had a period of time to tell the dancers that, that he thought that it wouldn't take effect until September 1st, which is typically when laws that are passed in the Texas legislature take effect, is September
Oh,
1st of the
okay.
same year. And so the
Mhm.
manager thought that they had time to give the dancers who are under 21. But actually, his lawyer called them the day after the piece of legislation got passed and said, "You need to fire all of these people immediately, or else you're in violation of the law."
Oh my gosh. So what have you heard from your friends that are under 21 about, like, how this is going to impact them?
I mean, it's all about how are they going to pay the bills. You know, they
Right.
they
Yeah.
they signed leases, they signed car loans, they signed student loans
Mhm.
with the intention of upkeeping the kind of money that they can make in the club. Now they have apartments
Right.
they can't afford, they have cars they can't afford. A lot of them have children to
Mhm.
take care of. I think people don't
Yeah.
understand that there is a disproportionate amount of young mothers that
Mhm.
end up entering forms of sex work, like working in a strip club. So, the minimum wage in Texas is $7.25 an hour.
Wow.
That's
Mhm.
not going to be able to feed their kids. That's not going to be
No
able
way.
to
They
pay
can't
their
even
bills.
take care of themselves with that, much less a kid.
Yeah, which is why a lot of them have to take on debt. I mean, a lot of people live off their student loans. A lot of people
Mhm.
take on, payday loans and dangerous predatory loans like that just to keep their heads above water and to take care of their families.
Right, right. Do you think that this is going like, what is your sense? Do you think that this is going to be permanent there, or do you think that people are gonna fight it?
People are definitely going to fight it. I'm in talks with a dancer from San Antonio to see if we can organize a lobby day to
Mhm.
speak with specifically the Democratic senators that signed onto this piece of legislation because it had bipartisan support.
Yeah, like Fosta Sesta. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. I not that it should surprise me anymore because I have witnessed the theater, if you will, of the Texas legislature um, for
Yeah.
a decade now, basically. And
Right.
there's this dance that happens between Texas Republicans and Texas Democrats, where Texas Republicans will introduce just the worst, most misogynist, transphobic, uh,
Mhm.
austerity bills, and the Democrats get to posture as progressives and try to kill these bills. But
Mhm.
the purpose of the bills is to, if you will, flex on the conservatives' constituents. That
Yeah. Mhm.
there's a lot of theater. There's a lot of Texas Republicans who introduce legislation that they don't really believe in, but that's what their conservative constituents want to hear, and they want to see anti-trans bills going through the legislature, and so that's what the Republicans give them, even when they know that it's not going to pass.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, like, as you were talking about it being bipartisan, the thing that's, like, kind of, like, brilliant about the anti-trafficking movement is that both Republicans and Democrats can get behind it for ostensibly, like, different reasons, but they're all because nobody wants to say that they're for trafficking because the way that it's framed makes it seem as if you were to fight against it, then you were somehow for human trafficking, which obviously, like, um, most people are not for. And so I think that a lot of the branding of these sort of conservative agendas end up making these bills pass like really quickly.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction to be made between the kind of backdoor conversations that happen amongst Republicans and between Republicans and Democrats about getting people back to work. I was actually talking to someone the other
Mhm.
day, and another light bulb moment where he said that SB 315 is a get back to work bill. It's a 18, 19, and 20-year-olds get back into restaurants and retail and customer service positions bill. Because if they're not working in the strip club, then
Wow.
they're either going to be pushed into more precarious forms of sex work, or they're going to be pushed into the service sector. They're going to be pushed back into wait staff jobs and the like, with
Mhm.
wages of $2.13 an hour plus tips. So even though a lot of people are getting fired and losing their jobs, it's actually because certain legislators want these people in different jobs. They still want them working, but in
Wow.
positions that
Yeah.
they think are most appropriate, which is not in the strip club.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but what I have been seeing is, restaurants closed, because there's not enough people working right now. That's kind of mind-boggling to me, that there would actually be, like, a agenda to, like, if we push everybody who's 18, 19, and 20 out of strip clubs, then we can get them in, like, restaurants
Yeah,
and other service jobs.
and this is happening at the same time that Governor Greg Abbott cut unemployment insurance early for the
Mhm.
state of Texas. You see this across, I believe it's 22 Republican states that are cutting the federal employment benefits early. So we were supposed to have our employment benefits cut off not until September, and Governor Abbott is pushing it up to the last week of June when our benefits are getting
Wow.
cutting off being get cut off. And I'm on unemployment right now, so I'm losing my unemployment early. And it's all about conservative posturing to this idea that there's a worker shortage or a labor shortage, and that's not true.
Right.
That's just wholly made up by business owners who want to be able to have control over precarious workers in the market. So
Mhm.
there is this connection between trying to foster people's financial precarity to the benefit of business owners that want to be able to force workers to contort to their demands and to their low
Right.
wages.
Yeah, I mean, because they wouldn't have a problem hiring if they gave people, like, reasonable wages.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, like, the conversation that people don't wanna have. Well, maybe people aren't going back into service jobs not because their benefits are so good, but because, like, the pay at these, like in these jobs is so bad that it's not even worth it.
Yeah, everybody kind of knows that that's true, but they don't want to say it explicitly. So that's why they pivot to a conversation about human trafficking and about sex trafficking of 18,
Yeah.
19, and 20-year-olds, is because they don't want to have the conversation
Mhm.
about the precarity of the workforce. They want to pivot to
Right.
a moral, emotional argument where they can prey on people's
Mhm.
ignorance of the issue of human trafficking and of sex trafficking and of the conditions that 18, 19, 20-year-old sex workers face. People don't want to
Right.
talk about that. So they instead do very simplified rhetoric around sex trafficking to be able to pull people into supporting legislation like SB 315.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about like decriminalization. I think we can kind of pivot there now because that's what's going on right now in Texas. But one of the things that you've been talking a lot about is decriminalization, which we've been talking about a lot on this show too, but not specifically from the perspective of dancers. And that's why I think your work is really interesting because you talk about why dancers in particular would benefit from decrim. And so I was curious if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I recently started a blog, Sex Worker Socialism, on Substack. And my first piece is a stripper's case for the full decriminalization of sex work, how the policing of sex work affects
Mhm.
strippers and what we gain from decriminalization. And I really wanted to address a lot of misconceptions about strippers' place in the sex worker spectrum, in the sex worker hierarchy, in the whorearchy, as we sometimes call it. And I
Yeah,
wanted
mhm,
to address misconceptions that legal sex workers are somehow safer from criminalization or from stigma or from
mhm,
widespread discrimination from banks and tech giants and society at large. And I wanted to make connections across sex workers precisely because it is policing that often connects us all. It is the threat
mhm,
of police and the threat of brutalization and incarceration that often connects us. And so in this piece, I talk about how decriminalization would benefit strippers, and I really hope that
mhm.
people can click on over to my Substack, marlacruz.substack.com, to get the full picture of my argument. But yeah, I wanted to tell people what I've seen personally as a stripper about the raid that happened in close to my city that affected me personally, and how I kind of view the criminalization of sex workers as intrinsically linked to the criminalization of prostitution at large.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about what happened at your raid.
There was a club. So I work in the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex, and
Okay,
there was a club in Fort Worth that got raided, and there were 6 dancers arrested from everything from prostitution to what's called public lewdness in Texas. And the public
okay.
lewdness charge itself is a rather flexible charge. The undercover officers in this raid uh, said that they were allegedly accused of sitting in undercover officers' laps and drinking alcohol, which, under this flexibility of this law, public lewdness, meant that they were going to be arrested for it. And that is I believe, a
Wow.
class A misdemeanor in Texas. And sexually related crimes like that, if you are convicted of them, that bars you from working in the strip club for up to 5 years. And so
Oh my gosh.
it wasn't just being arrested
Mhm.
that was on the line. It was losing their job for 5 years that was on the line.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I just want people to understand that, like, this, I think a lot of people might hear this story and think like, "Oh, well, that's Texas, that's the South. That's just how they are there." It's like, no,
Mhm,
these strip club raids happen dozens of times throughout the year all across the country, and none of us are
mhm.
safe. Because I was working in Dallas at the time. This was
Right.
in the summer of 2019, and I see
Mhm,
this raid happening, and immediately I'm terrified because this article of
mhm.
this raid that has these 6 dancers mugshots plastered all over, they were management at my club at the time put copies of this article all over the dressing room to basically warn
Oh my
us.
gosh.
Yeah, to warn us that
Okay.
there were raids happening in the area. And just imagine clocking into work every day and seeing the mugshots of people who were arrested for something like sitting in an officer's lap and drinking alcohol. Like that, you feel like there's a
Right.
target on your back, because there is a target on your back
Yeah.
when police start doing these raids,
Mhm.
because it doesn't, you
Right.
don't have to be offering sex for money to be arrested. It is completely on the whims of
Mm-hmm.
officers, and police officers lie all the time. They get trumped up charges
Right.
all the
That's what I
time.
was gonna say. Yeah.
So you can't trust the word of a police officer in these raids, and that puts you
Right.
at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important what you're saying because within this hierarchy, there is a lot of emphasis on like who's in the most like danger and like um whose work is criminalized and whose work isn't criminalized. And I think you're right to point out that like those lines are actually really blurry and that all sex workers are put in precarious positions for different reasons.
Yeah, it is the police who make
Mhm.
these lines blurry. It is the police
Yeah.
who collapse these distinctions between legal sex workers like strippers and illegal sex workers like prostitutes, because to the police we're one and the same. To the
Right.
police,
Mhm.
strip clubs
And to
are hubs of
society at
crime.
large, I think. I think that that's true for people outside of sex work too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a distinction about what power the people around us as sex workers have to leverage against us, in the courts, for example, because
Mhm.
it's one thing to have somebody who is like a complete layperson, like not a cop, not a public official, not a judge, not anybody that could get me in trouble personally. Like if they
Right.
think strippers and prostitutes are the same people, that doesn't mean much to me. But
Yeah.
if my local police believes that the strippers are doing prostitution, like that matters to me because they could put me in jail.
Right. Mhm.
So, whenever we look at these institutions themselves that collapse these distinctions among sex workers, I think the solution to that is to take away that power that they have over us. The solution to
Right.
that is to break up these vice cops that are so corrupt that every week we have a new corruption scandal in vice squads across the
Mhm.
country.
Mhm.
It's to defund the police so they aren't
Right.
using their resources to terrorize sex workers inside and outside of the strip club. Like, the answer is
Mhm.
to take away these people's power over us.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think they should just dismantle vice cops. I don't think there's any like reason to have them
So
at all.
what's funny is that the Dallas Police Department actually disbanded their vice unit. I believe it was in 2017 for like widespread violation of policies, and then
Mhm.
they got them back together. I think it was in 2019. And their renewed focus of this newly reformed vice unit was going to be on human trafficking, gambling, and prostitution. And so that was
Great.
happening at the same time that I'm seeing, all these flyers
Mhm.
plastered up on the walls of my dressing room at the club saying,
Right.
the cops are out and you need to be careful because we are not liable if anything happens to you.
Yeah, and I imagine I mean, I've never been a dancer. That's one of the types of sex work that I haven't done, but, I'm thinking about this as you're talking, like, it must be so scary because, like, if you're doing escorting, for example, you can, like, ask people for their, work identification and things like that before you even engage with them to know that they're not, police officers. But if you're giving a lap dance, it's not as if you check ID before you do that or sitting on somebody's lap. And so I don't know, I imagine that that must put you on edge the whole time you're working.
It does. It does. And lucky for me, I feel like I know enough about the local police to have a more discerning eye for whether or not somebody
Mhm.
is a cop or acting like a cop. Not saying that I'm like
Mhm.
psychic, that I could read cops' minds and know if they're an undercover cop or not, but that there are certain things, there are certain distinctions. There are just certain actions that happen that I see over and over again in these vice raids that I try to use my discerning eye in the club whenever I'm working and think like, is he acting like a cop?
Yeah.
Is my gut
Mhm.
telling me to walk away from this person? Because your gut is
Right.
always right. Your gut will keep you safe in work like this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, but that's still not, not everybody is necessarily good at that. And going into a work situation in which you're not sure if there's undercover cops sitting there is something that's, I'm sure, like very unnerving.
Yeah, and it is the most precarious dancers that are the most at risk, because
Right.
if you can afford to turn down somebody's offer for,
Yeah.
sex for money, then you can then that is a privilege, basically, to be able to have that
Yeah.
discerning eye and to be able to turn down customers that you think are a little too suspicious. But
Mhm.
if you are precarious, if you have a family to feed, you feel an obligation to bring home as much money as possible, because it's not just your livelihood and well-being that's on the line. It's the
Right.
well-being of your whole family. It's the well-being of the people that you're taking care of.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you think, how do you think that decrim would, help dancers? Why do you think that dancers should get behind it?
One thing I talk about in this piece is exploitative management. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is that sometimes dancers will be caught doing prostitution in the club, and
Mhm.
the management will tell her in no minced words that if you want to keep doing that, if you want to not be fired, you're going to have to give us a cut of your earnings.
Mm. Mhm.
And so dancers get extorted by management like
Right.
this. This
Mhm.
it's one thing to be fired, it's another thing to have management with their grubby little hands in your money every shift,
Right.
and with this threat that they could fire
Holding
you
that
at any
over you.
moment. Yeah, yeah, it's extortion. It's
Right.
100%
Mhm.
extortion.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this happens a lot when you have
Yeah.
strip clubs with really bad working conditions, where the workers don't have much power or much of a say in the conditions of the club itself. Things like that are more prone to happen because management knows that they can get away with it. And they
Mhm.
know that there are enough precarious workers to where they can exploit people if they want to, and because they don't have the financial ability to walk away because they need the money.
Yeah. Right. Mhm.
So that's one way. And whenever I talk about exploitative management, I also talk about management that colludes with the police, because
Right.
dressing room lore, as I call it, often whenever you speak to dancers who work in clubs where prostitution is common, they attribute that permissiveness in the club from managers to managers working with local police, basically paying a bounty to local police for them not to do raids in the clubs. And I've heard this
Mm.
from dancers like across states, like everywhere from
Yeah.
like Philadelphia to Houston to New Orleans. Like this is such a common belief for
Mhm.
strippers to talk about, that to me it's like I wish there was some data. I wish there was something that I could prove that this is happening. But to us, it just makes sense that the club owners, who are fabulously wealthy, I mean, these are like
Right. Mhm.
millionaires with multiple homes across states, taking private jets
Yeah.
sometimes, like they are absurdly wealthy. Like, of course, if they could get away with it, they would be paying off the local police.
Right, right. Yeah, but then still, like, extorting dancers because dancers aren't sure, like, what they're going to do
Right. I mean, there's this
and
like
pulling money. Mhm.
yeah, there's this symbiotic relationship, if you will, between exploitative management and club owners and the police. It's like at every turn, people are colluding against strippers to like extract us for money and to threaten us with criminalization.
Right, right. Yeah, and that wouldn't be possible if sex work was decriminalized.
Right. And it would give us more powers as
Mhm.
workers in the club if the management couldn't extort us and couldn't threaten to extort us, because a lot of the times it's not just the violence and the extortion itself, it's the threat of violence and extortion that
Mhm.
keeps people in
Mhm.
line. I mean, like I was saying earlier, how I felt terrified working in 2019 after seeing this club raid happen locally, because I felt on edge and anxious. And it's that fear that these
Right.
institutions like the police want to strike in you to keep you in line, basically, to control
Mhm.
you without ever having to lay a hand on you.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really interesting. Is there, anything else that you think is important as we're thinking about, these, laws to keep young people out of strip clubs or decriminalization movements?
When it comes to the younger workers in strip clubs, I want people to recognize that legislation like SB 315, it works backwards in a sense, because it bars these young adults from certain avenues of supporting themselves rather than addressing their financial needs where they begin, like expensive tuition or the poverty wage
Mm-hmm.
jobs that they have, or the ever increasing rent that always seems to go up and nobody can explain why. So
Right.
this kind
Mm-hmm.
of imagined innocence that's like projected onto these young adults is completely contradicted by the obligations that they are saddled with as 18 to 20-year-olds, like student
Yeah.
debt and liability
Mm-hmm.
and contracts and raising children, just to name a
Right.
few.
Mm-hmm.
So, as kind of amorphous as this period of between childhood and adulthood is,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of young women are already familiar with these social and financial obligations of adulthood before they ever work in a club, right? A lot of
Right.
them
Yeah.
are mothers, they are household breadwinners, they are full-time caretakers. They have long been taking on all forms of feminized work that have been
Right.
completely wrought of their monetary value and expected to be fulfilled without demands or without compensation. These people
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
they are, in every sense of the word, an adult. They are saddled with adult bills and adult obligations. So for someone to come along and say that they're too innocent to work in a club, it doesn't make any
Right.
sense.
No, it doesn't at all, and it totally infantilizes actual adults. um, it infantilizes them, and I think it also like doesn't take into consideration, like you said, all the work that they are expected to do and the responsibilities that they're expected to take on.
Right.
Or and I think another important thing that you said that I always go back to when we talk about, like, any of the, trafficking narratives that are getting pushed is that pushing people out of the sex industry does nothing like, regardless of their age, like, further criminalizing, all for like, different forms of erotic labor, like, doesn't do anything to address why people are moving into the sex industry in the first place, and why, they can't meet their needs, in other ways.
Right. A motto of the sex workers' rights movement is rights, not rescue, resources, not rescue. Like that's these people
Right,
need
yeah.
money. That's what they need. Give them money, give them housing, give them childcare, give them free education. Like
Mhm.
address their financial needs where they are instead of trying to keep them from fulfilling those financial needs by working in a strip club.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, if the problem is but I mean, I don't think it is, but if the problem really is that, you know, they wanna shut down the sex industry, there needs to be other options, and there just isn't. There isn't the same kinda options outside of sex work for people who need, like, flexible employment that pays well.
Yeah, especially because a lot of these young people are trying to put themselves through school or take care of kids or take care of dependents and their
Mhm.
family. I mean, not everybody can work full time.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, and I also think that another thing that isn't intuitive to people who are outside of the sex industry is that the sex industry can often be like a safety net for people who have lots of reasons why they can't work full time in conventional employment that include disability and caretaking responsibilities and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and having these conversations like amongst sex workers, it seems so obvious. The
It does.
solutions to these problems are just staring us right in the face. But when we try to
Mhm.
convince society at large that like, no, this is what we need resources, not rescue, it just
Right.
goes in one ear and out the other.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people have some sort of magical thinking, I think, that like, oh, well, if people just stop doing sex work, then they'll do something else. But there's no thought put into what that something else is or how accessible it is. I think it's an issue of accessibility for a lot of people. And um yeah, it's just I it seems disingenuous for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should not underestimate the amount of people that implicitly understand the need the need of the market to have a very precarious malleable workforce. I think there are a lot of people
Mhm.
out there that understand very clearly the economic aspect of this issue, but who have a vested interest in the precarity of poor people to keep them as flexible to the demands of the market as possible. And I think that's
Right.
kind of a perfect distillation of what we've seen in Texas recently, with this convergence of fostering economic precarity with shutting off avenues of addressing that precarity through something like sex work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that that's a good place to end. Where can people find your Substack and your Twitter and you online?
You can find my less serious side on Twitter at pro la peach. And you can find my most serious side on Substack. My new blog, Sex Worker Socialism, just dropped last month. My upcoming piece should be out this week, a kind of a full length investigation of this bill, Texas SB 315, and how to address it from here. You can
Oh, wow.
find that on marlacruz.substack.com. And yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really great to hear your perspective as somebody who's there on the ground, seeing how all of these things are unfolding.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.